what we all love to talk about, and that's money, right? We love to talk about money. I'm just joking. Most of us don't, but we need to because tragic things can happen when you don't manage your money right, when you don't manage supply chain and inventory and all these different components. So without further ado, we have Donna Oren from 8Fig here with us. Donna, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Josh and team. I can only hope to match your energy and the level of caffeine that you've got flowing in your veins right now.
Yeah, it is. It's a problem. It's an addiction and a problem. I'm in cup 3. We're sitting at like 11:30 in the morning, and so fun fact for you. And so our team at our office, I'm super nerdy about my coffee. So like we weigh the water to the coffee ratio. We grind the coffee at a certain fineness, and then we have these. We have a brewer that actually brews it at 205 degrees, which fun fact is the ideal temperature to brew coffee to extract the maximum flavor. We're really nerdy about it. So,
well, with a name like
lying.
Josh Coffee, you didn't really have much choice in the matter.
Yeah, I committed. I just, at one point in my life, I'm like, you know what? I'm leaning into my last name here. If I'm a tea guy, I'm a fraud.
Exactly. And we're not having that. We're not having frauds on this podcast.
That's right. So, Don, if you could, let's kind of introduce yourself and tell everybody a little bit about you and kind of what you do to get us rolling here.
Yeah, of course, happy to. So I'm 8Fig's VP of product. What 8Fig does is we solve sellers' number one problem, which is, of course, working capital, or, another term for money, basically, which is what you said. Nobody really likes to talk about it, but everybody needs it, and everybody spends their waking hours worrying about it. So 8Fig has developed a unique model of financing, which is custom for e-commerce and solves a lot of the problems that we see with other traditional financing products, like lack of flexibility or, not being adapted to a seller's actual supply chain and cash flow. But we also develop a whole suite of tools that are meant to help sellers scale from 6 to 8 figures and even beyond. That's everything from analytics tools, planning tools in order to really get a better hold of your supply chain, conduct more accurate forecasting, and really everything that a seller needs in order to get to that coveted 8-figure status.
Wow. So you guys have even additional tools that are like for forecasting and like helping them plan everything properly. Does that integrate with like Shopify or whatever the tool is?
Yeah.
The CRM?
Yeah.
Or CMS, I'm sorry.
So a lot of people, I think, are under the conception that 8Fig is just a funding tool, and that's perfectly fine. If you're going to be known for something, for doing something well, it's amazing that we're known for really breaking a lot of financing paradigms and doing it very differently than everyone. But we're also a lot more. There's a lot more below the surface there. You can make a free account on 8fig.co and just use it for all the other tools. And then once you need financing, by all means, we'd love to be everyone's first choice. But you can also just use the other tools. They're completely free.
Oh, wow. Oh, that's really cool. So 8fig.co. Yeah, everybody go check that out. I didn't sign up for free. It sounds like you get some amazing tools. I wish I knew about that. So the reason I brought you on, and I'm excited that your team reached out and we coordinated this podcast here, Donna, is because so a year and a half ago, we had a situation with a client, and I've had a lot of these conversations. I had another one last week with somebody, and we had this client, and everything was going really well. Like they had first year, they did like $500,000-$600,000 in revenue in year 1. Year 2, they're working with us on the marketing front. Our team is helping with a lot of things. We're running 16x return on ad spend. Like we're just killing it out of the gates. They go from like $30,000 to $40,000 a month in revenue up to like we're having $100,000 months in a matter of like no time flat. Things are going really well. They're on track to do 1.2 million. And so I received a call from the owner. And I felt so bad. I picked up the call. I'm like, hey man, how's it going? Like we had developed a friendship at this point, and he was kind of crying, kind of hard on his hands, telling me we are going bankrupt. And in my mind, I was like, man, how? Like what? Like everything's been going so well. And so what happened was, and I didn't know this until that moment, was we were selling everything, but we sold so much that they got in this crunch where they had continued selling. And then what happened is they ran out of inventory, but sales were still coming in and they didn't close the shop. So sales were still coming in for their primary major product that we were selling. And that's the entry point. Is they sold like a few products, like 3, and they were all a variation of one big product. So we're selling this, and then they get to this point where he had to place a minimum order. And that minimum order was, I forget how many hundreds of thousands, but he was like 100,000 or something like that short. It was like $80,000 or $100,000 short, and he couldn't make the gap. He couldn't do anything to make that happen. And now he had all these orders placed, and so he had to now refund $30,000 in sales, but he also needed this gap, and so he ran into a really bad situation. Ended up closing down the business, and it was heartbreaking to see. So, I mean, how I've seen that firsthand. I've never seen it happen, like go bankrupt like that bad, but I see inventory and purchasing like a huge issue that people don't really understand. Like, do you guys ever see that kind of stuff when people come to you with those situations?
Absolutely. So it's really the foundation of everything. You have these e-commerce sellers who are these sort of one person show, sometimes like 2 people, but they're supernovas. They're doing absolutely everything, right? From supply chain, which includes procurement, which includes marketing in a lot of cases, to managing bookkeeping, to managing personnel, to managing, sourcing suppliers, being a buyer, being an analyst. They're just, every waking hour of every single day, they are doing everything in their power to scale these businesses. And these businesses, thankfully, they smile right back at them, and they scale, and they're profitable, and they're amazing. Just like your former client and friend, who experienced that amazing year, 500,000 on track to grow to 1.2 in a year. Those are not super rare cases in e-commerce. That type of growth, that 2x in a year or whatever it may be. But in other small and medium businesses, that's definitely very, very rare. You don't see that type of hyper growth. So that's the good part of e-commerce, is the opportunity and the ability to scale really, really quickly. And the ability to also, for a certain period of time, to do it all yourself or with a very, very small team. The flip side of that is the inherent qualities about e-commerce that make it significantly more challenging than perhaps the traditional business. And one of them is what you just described, which we call at 8Fig the cash flow crunch. And that is, I'll try to sort of put it in the plainest terms that I can. It's the gap in time between placing an order, having to pay for that order from your manufacturer, having to pay for freight, having to pay for logistics, all of those supply chain costs that you have to foot before even selling one unit, even seeing $1 in return from that batch. So it's the gap in time between paying all of that and actually seeing revenue from that batch, from that order. That gap can be sometimes as long as 5-6 months. That's very, very hard for a business to sustain. First of all, 5-6 months, just putting money on something and not seeing it return. But secondly, it makes it very hard, if not almost impossible, to grow, right? Because your demand may be growing, right? Your product is gaining popularity, which means that you're perhaps selling out of a previous batch faster than you thought. You're now in danger of going out of stock. It means that you needed to place an order months ago, right? But again, that money wasn't available to you at the time. So again, you're having trouble meeting demand. You're having trouble remaining consistently stocked. These are all quote unquote champagne problems, but they're real problems that sellers are dealing with every day, that are stifling their growth, that are sometimes, like in the sad story that you described, causing them to close down their store, an incredibly profitable store that was killing it on all fronts. And we see that every single day almost at 8Fig, especially with the year that we've had in 2021 with supply chain issues and the great supply chain disruption of 2021, which it's funny to talk about it in past tense as though it's not still going on and as though our ports are not still congested. But definitely the novelty of it has worn off a little bit, and sellers have adjusted their supply chains a little bit to take into account the longer lead times, the higher costs on almost every category. Nevertheless, the problem is still very, very palpable, and it needs adequate financing solutions that can support this massively growing sector without driving sellers to make these very, very unfortunate decisions, and ultimately narrowing the playing field to just those who are flush with cash. And of course, we know who those players are, and it's not the little guy.
Yeah, yeah. No, so I guess like, so if I'm listening and my e-commerce business is doing like 5,000 or 3,000 or 10,000 a month, and it's not doing six figures, like, what do you say to those people that are in that cash flow crunch? Which, by the way, I'm stealing that because I think that's the best. I never knew the way to put it. Cash flow crunch. It makes so much sense. That's what I'm gonna start using. But like for people that are like smaller, like let's say they're just starting, do you even recommend like funding, like having working capital even in those smaller situations? Like, is there a point where you guys are like, hey, we've seen from a large database of people we work with that at this point it's probably not worth it, and you're better off just waiting or personally funding it?
So we do have large data sets of not only sellers and stores, but also supply chain planning. So one of the good things about 8fig is that we're able to help sellers benchmark the health of their supply chain, their ordering cadence, their forecasting, their growth against, thousands of other stores, of other orders. Which gives you all the time this sort of pulse to keep up with and measure yourself against, whether you're overpaying, underpaying, waiting too long, when it's time to sort of survey the market a little bit, and even looking at your bottom line, at your unit economics, which is really helpful for that e-commerce seller who, like we said, is a lone wolf sometimes and doesn't really have colleagues all the time to consult, or maybe masterminds, but they crave that community is a really, really good way to keep them connected to what's going on in the market. As for what the right time is to take on funding, that is really up to the individual seller, the seller's growth trajectory, the seller's history with the particular product, and that's, everyone is welcome to apply on 8fig.co. And even if it's not the right time to take on funding, just use the suite of tools. Try to get, to a critical mass of revenue, and when the time comes, hit the ground running.
So like, so what do you say to someone who because I also see the other side. So I see like, okay, like I don't take on. In our business now, my business is not e-commerce, so I'm not floating stuff for minimum order quantities. But I don't personally take on debt for expansion in my business. But I'm also not in e-commerce, so it's a little bit different from like the inventory buying and minimum order quantity. You can get that in, you could sell it, you drive the profit from it. So like, what do you say to someone that's like, I see the value in it, because like I could see that if I had an e-commerce store, I can see the value in that. What do you say to someone that's like, I don't want to get upside down though, or get in that? Because I've also seen this, and I will throw this out there. I had another client we worked with who did get funding in their situation, and it could have been the company, interest rates, whatever, and they just, no matter what, couldn't seem to get out of it even when they were selling. So what do you say to someone that like doesn't want to get upside down? Like, how do you fight not getting upside down in that situation if you took on funding?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting, the state of mind, which is obviously very, very individual, of when to take on funding, how much, and what for. And with e-commerce sellers, a lot of the times it comes down to this nagging feeling of, I could grow much, much more if I just had the working capital to do it. And that's why a lot of times at 8fig, well, we say this internally and sometimes externally with clients, is when you sit down in front of the Line Lab, which is one of 8fig's features and tools. This is for planning supply chain. And you are getting ready to map out some orders coming up. You have two choices. You could either take, whatever the last order was, order exactly the same, or you could do a little bit of research. And you could think of, how much could I grow? What's possible here, right? Maybe if I increased the units, and maybe if I increased the marketing, okay, maybe I could seize more market share there. And then thinking about what's possible. So at 8fig internally, we say plan as if nobody's watching, but plan really for growth, plan for what's possible and not just for what you can afford, because 8fig takes that completely out of the equation. So we will fund sellers for growth, for the growth that they're capable of, they believe that they're capable of, that we believe that they're capable of. Obviously, there needs to be alignment there, but it can be very, very significant growth. And thus far, we've seen that 8fig sellers indeed manage to accelerate their growth twice as much as sellers who are not with 8fig, so who are not funded by 8fig, meaning that growth is there for the taking. Whether you take it or one of your competitors takes it, it's there. E-commerce is growing as a sector. Demand is growing constantly for almost every product category. We saw it, of course, in the pandemic when people sitting on the sidelines of online consumption suddenly were thrusted into online consumption on every single category. But even before the pandemic, even before all those freak trends and spikes, e-commerce was only heading one way. It was only growing, and it's continuing to grow. We may have accelerated that growth, but it's continuing to grow, which means that demand is there. That growth is there. Whether you take it, your competitors take it, or you pull yourself out of the game is up to you.
Yeah, it's so we do in Q4 we do a holiday sales boot camp where we train e-commerce owners on how to take advantage of the Q4. Q4 is the largest quarter for most. And fun fact, Q4 this year, I think did $240 billion in the US just in Q4 versus 2019 pre-pandemic is 155 billion. And so that kind of growth is almost $90 billion in growth in a matter of 2 years from this. So you're right, the trending is definitely going up. I do like that idea of, planning for growth above that, because then if you don't allot for that, let's say inventory, then you start to approach the end of it, but then you don't have enough margin to then cover that cash flow crunch you're talking about. That's a crappy situation to be in. But you also mentioned something else.
Yeah, sorry. And also remember, 8fig has a unique feature in its financing model of flexibility, meaning let's say you went for it. You reached for the stars. You ordered 5 times as much inventory as you've sold in the past based on forecasting models, whatever. Our team agreed with you. Everything's great. You're heading there. And then it lands, you start selling. Things aren't going as well as you'd hoped. They're going well, but not as well as you'd hoped. You always have the benefit of flexibility with 8fig, whether it means slowing down your remittances without affecting your cost of capital, whether it means making a change to the next order, increasing it, decreasing it, even canceling it. It's really whatever you need, whatever your business needs to remain healthy. So your friend's situation, your former client who found themselves, strapped for cash, was missing 80, 100 grand that he needed. It was time sensitive, and it resulted in the crumbling of his entire store. I hate to say it because it sounds so simple, but it really is. For an 8fig seller, it's as simple as, all right, I'm going to log in and I'm just going to add 100 grand to this stage. Within a few hours, it's approved. That's it. It shifted your plan. We're good. We're good to go. We're set. These things happen every single day. Our change request feature, which is what I just described sort of in a nutshell, but there's numerous changes that you can make. It's used by nearly 100% of our sellers, of our active sellers. And that's why we saw such a smaller impact on them with all the supply chain disruptions and the demand fluctuations and the stockouts that were so commonplace in 2020 and 2021.
So if I was, if I've ever contemplated the idea of funding, and I know most people listening to this at some point have considered it, but sometimes it's a daunting, intimidating, scary concept of taking on debt. How could this really work? You brought up another point that I didn't really think about as well, because most people talk to me about funding more for working capital, primarily for inventory. That's probably the most common one I hear. But you started bringing up marketing and other things as well for expansion and market share growth. So when someone, if I was new and I'm okay, I've thought about this and I'm interested in starting this process, how do most people plan their funding? Because you brought up a couple other angles. Or are there things that you recommend people that are looking at working capital, like things that they take into consideration for building a game plan outside of just inventory? Like if you were to spread it out on a plate and say, these are the things I would consider, like what would be the different side dishes and stuff?
Side dishes. I love that. So luckily, the way that 8fig funds, it's all based on supply chain, right? But supply chain, people, I think, often think of, okay, inventory and shipping, basically. But the way that we view supply chain is in what we call lines. And an 8fig line is, traditionally composed of 5 stages: inventory deposit, inventory balance. So those two are inventory, right? Freight, looking at the cost to get goods from wherever your manufacturer is to typically we're talking about the United States, into your warehouses. Then you've got logistics, so that's your 3PL. If you're a Shopify seller or not an FBA seller, we're talking about fulfillment as well. That's also part of logistics. And then finally, marketing. There's also an other stage, meaning the stage is called other. This is for whatever other expense the seller may be encountering in your supply chain. Exactly. But typically we're talking about those 5, about deposit, balance, freight, logistics, and marketing. And marketing, sometimes sellers are, sort of pleasantly surprised that 8fig will also fund marketing, but it is an inseparable part of a seller's COGS and therefore their supply chain. This is an expected expense for every single batch, every single unit, in the vast majority of cases. And if you're not doing marketing, maybe that's actually something to look at. So that's how planning is done on the 8fig platform, and the 8fig system is mapping out when you need to pay those things over, let's say, the course of 6 months, a year, however long you want to plan for. And remember, it's all flexible. So it can also be like these building blocks that you then change, giving the seller a good overview of their cash flow, of their anticipated needs, and giving our team also a great way to sort of understand, all right, where is he going with this? How much is he trying to grow? Got it. Okay.
Gotcha. Oh, well, so I'm kind of curious, what's a story of somebody that has maybe done this and been able to experience that hyper growth? Because when I think of this, I think this is very forward thinking. This is very hyper growth mindset. Really, if you're starting to plan and do all these things, you're planning for rapid growth. And so what's an example of someone that maybe did come in and do that? I'm just curious, what kind of stuff are people seeing from a results and growth standpoint?
Yeah. So first of all, thank you for the compliment about how it's very different. I think that stems actually from us, being founded by supply chain experts, which are really coming at it from a different perspective of get your supply chain right, and then everything else sort of falls into place. Understanding ordering cadence, accurate forecasting, and effective planning are things that are just not really on the radar of other financing solutions, and they're the heart of 8fig. They're everything at 8fig, which is why we're able to help sellers grow in, on one hand, a super, super quick way, but on the other hand, a sustainable way that doesn't put crazy strain on the business. So to your question about, remind me, sorry, the question?
What's an example of someone what did they come in with? How did they grow? What's a success story, I guess, kind of. Yeah. I'm just curious.
So even though as a blanket, you could see sellers who have accelerated their growth twice as much as sellers who don't work with 8fig. When you really zero in on your tremendous success stories, we've got sellers who within 1 year went from just barely making it to the six-figure mark, scaling all the way to 7 figures, celebrating with us. When in Q4, I still remember this, an excited seller that we have that happened to speak to me a lot of times. So she emailed me showing me, look, Donna, I had all 5-figure days in the month of December. All 5-figure days. And this is a seller who just a short year prior was, barely making it to the six figure mark and saying, okay, I think this ecom thing is going to work out. I think I can actually devote, my time and my talents to this and maybe quit my day job. And I think so many sellers are doing it with that in mind of, wow, this could be really, really big, and seeing that early success and seeing the potential that e-commerce has, but then very quickly also seeing those shortcomings, that cash flow crunch, those time gaps, that stress, those supply chain woes that you constantly have to deal with. But it all pays off when you see how quickly it ramps up, which is just truly an amazing characteristic of e-commerce. There's nothing quite like it.
So, I mean, for sure, she had to have funded marketing to grow like that in some capacity.
Definitely funded marketing. And you know what? It's even more impressive because around April of last year, she contacted us and she said, hey guys, she didn't know that we offered change requests, which is, that's commonplace. Sellers sometimes they're not fully versed in what services they take on. And she contacted us in April of last year and she said, guys, this is a disaster. I've been out of stock. My inventory, which I ordered on time, I was responsible, I was diligent. It's been stuck at the LA port for I think like 11 weeks, something crazy like that. They officially went out of stock. She was like, I don't know how I'm going to recover from this. And this was the same year that she hit all 5-figure days in December. So this is April and that's December. We talked to her, let her know about the concept of change requests. She couldn't believe it. She submitted whatever needed to be submitted. And then she was able to pivot and actually focus on, all right, how do I get this stock out of the port into the warehouse and start selling it, ramping up, and then adding more and more products, ordering them well in advance. And all of this led to, a Q4 for the books.
That's amazing. And so, when I think of funding and capital, and first thing that comes to my mind is credit cards. So from an industry average standpoint, and obviously it varies, but just so anyone listening can understand, what are the typical ranges of interest that are usually involved in working capital in companies like you guys?
Oh, sure. So 8Fig is more of a legal matter. 8Fig is not a lender, so we don't use interest in order to calculate the cost of plans. What we do is essentially once a seller creates a plan, we then analyze it for risk. We have a team of data scientists who are also e-commerce and supply chain experts, and they look at demand, they look at competitors, they look at everything. And then they assign a risk score, which then determines the price of that plan, the cost of capital, if you will. That typically falls within a range of about $6,000 to $10,000 for every $100,000 that are borrowed.
Okay. So if you just run numbers on that, 6 to 10%. Essentially.
Sure. Yes. I will say that
off the record, just me saying that.
Yeah, it's hard to annualize it because, for example, our plans are typically about 13 months long. We do have sellers who extend beyond that to 2 years. It's still always going to be around 6 to 10. So, I mean, the longer your plan is, essentially, the more you're benefiting.
Oh, so that's kind of cool. So it's almost like fixed rate, really. Obviously, it's a percentage of the overall, but it's like a fixed rate. That out of this is what I'm going to pay for the convenience of getting the working capital now to then fund my growth.
Exactly.
Interesting. Oh, I didn't know that. I actually thought for some reason it worked on an interest basis, but it sounds like it's a little bit different than that. So kind of walk me through the process. If I'm listening right now, I'm like, hey, this sounds interesting to me, Donna. You mentioned a growth plan or a growth strategy. What's the process that typically somebody would go through to initiate this process for their business?
Awesome. So you go to 8fig.co. Read through our case studies, whatever you need. And then you would click start here, or there's numerous prompts there that are meant to get you going. At that point, it's going to ask you a few questions about your store, about your revenue, about what you would like to fund. And then you're going to very quickly dive into what we call planning, the planning portion. We're going to ask you to just tell us about your next order, your upcoming order. What does it look like? How much are you going to pay? More or less, what are the dates? And remember, none of this has to be so precise. It's very, very flexible. We emphasize that everywhere. But of course, I understand there's this inherent fear when it comes to funding. Like, what if I didn't, mention these 15 cents? That's perfectly fine. Don't worry about it. After that, we do a little bit of data crunching. We extrapolate, create a full year's plan for you. You can review that. Submit your application. Of course, we require a connected store in order to give you an offer. But at that point, you're really ready to activate. The whole thing, onboarding, takes about like 7-8 minutes maybe. Connecting your stores, within seconds, and then you can get a plan in as short as a few hours, as long as probably one business day.
Okay. So, that's really cool. And you guys have the free tools too. So,
you can keep yourself busy with the analytics dashboard, with the planning tool, adding more and more products, adding more and more batches, playing around with it, doing whatever you'd like. And then once you get your plan, it's go time. It's money time.
Awesome. So the reason for anybody listening, at the very least, I think that anyone needs to go get the free tools. Start planning, be intentional about managing your business. And the reason I wanted to bring you on and talk about this, Donna, and really particularly kind of focusing on 8Fig is, first of all, anyone listening, I'm not associated. I don't get paid for 8Fig being on here. I just see this as a common issue in the e-commerce world that people run into, and they find themselves in bad situations that, if our previous client, unfortunately, if previously found himself in this situation, if he was able to cover that gap, where the business would be now, maybe it would have been running a $2.5 million business this year, but ran into that crunch. And so if you're listening and you're kind of hearing this, number one, you need to plan your money. You have to be intentional about your cash flow and not find yourself in a cash flow crunch that you can't get out of. That's so dangerous. Tragic stories happen every single day, which is why so many businesses fail. And in the e-com world, that's one of the most common ones that I see firsthand with the thousands and thousands of people that are in our communities and our email lists and things like that. So all that said, I recommend you go to 8fig.co. I think it's cool you guys have free tools. And then if you guys want to try out, go through the whole process with them and start looking into this and get your own growth plan, I would do that if I had an e-commerce store right now. But I guess kind of to close here, Donna, where's the best place if people are interested in, other than the website, obviously we just mentioned that, 8fig.co, where's another good spot for people to really connect with 8Fig, or even you, if you do your personal stuff?
Yeah, sure, of course. So in order to connect with 8Fig, we've got some pretty cool social media feeds that are constantly giving updates about the state of the industry at large, and sort of news coming out of Amazon or just economics. And then you can follow there. We have a Twitter feed. It's 8Fig, spelled out EIGHTFIG. And we also have Instagram, which is at 8Fig. This time it's the figure 8, FIG.co. If you just search for 8Fig, I think on either one of those platforms, it should be the first one that pops up. And everyone is welcome to email us at service@8fig.co, or me personally, Donna, at 8fig.co. I'd love to have discussions with you, hear about everything that you've been going through and how 8Fig can help you do it better and at scale.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Donna, thank you so much for hanging out with me here. I appreciate it. I'm sure anyone who's listening right now has more knowledge that can help guide them in their business growth. But for all of you listening, we want to say thank you. Thank you for being our listener and for hanging out with us today. You, of course, have been listening to the Ecommerce Alley podcast, produced by the legendary man behind the curtains that one day you'll eventually meet, Dylan Counts. If you want to join our Facebook group, that is absolutely free, and you'll get tons of additional value, weekly live sessions, templates, documents, things to help grow your e-commerce business. Go to alleypodcast.com/group. It'll take you to the page. You can join that for free. With that said, Donna and I want to say thank you for tuning in today, and we will see you in the next episode.
Thanks, everyone.